We will be back in session, and we're now at the point in the agenda where we have the approval of the minutes. And the minutes are before the Board of Regents for our January 6, 2015 meeting. Is there a motion to approve?
Motion to approve.
The motion has, there's been a motion made by Regent Albrecht. Is there further discussion? Is there any discussion? Any discussion at all? Seeing none, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. The ayes have it. Commissioner, system report. Oh, I'm sorry, we're at campus introductions. I apologize for that. Do we have any campus introductions from the presidents? No, we do not. Yes. MSU Billings.
I'll do this quickly. It's not really an introduction, but I'd like to say goodbye to Mark Pagano. Mark has been our provost for the last 3 to 4, almost 4 years now. And our provost has accepted the position of chancellor at the University of Washington, Tacoma, and will be leaving us at the end of next week. So this is his last Regent meeting. Mark has really been a wonder at helping us establish a very collaborative relationship with our faculty and staff. He's also been key to helping establish the MSUB Extended Campus. He's really done a great job at strengthening our honors program, international student programs, and grants and sponsored programs. He also was the person that led our attempts to pull together the academic program prioritization, which if we hadn't had those completed, we wouldn't have been able to move through the budgets that we've been moving through in the last few weeks. So with that, I'd like to take a moment to recognize the contributions that Mark has made to not just MSU Billings, but the entire Montana University system. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you for your service to the Montana University system. I believe, Dean Wolf, do you have an announcement about an upcoming event at Great Falls College? If you want to do that now, that would be appropriate.
Thank you, Chair Tuss and the board. I'd like to just remind everyone and inform the board that on April 10th, we're going to be hosting the 3rd Annual Student Research Day for the Montana two-year colleges at Great Falls College, MSU. And Dr. Heidi Pasick has placed information around your tables and then around the room. And for the colleges who have yet to go ahead and register your teams or your students, please do so. I think we're almost full, but we certainly welcome more. And this is going to be a very exciting event for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Wolf. President Engstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am remiss because I guess I did introduce our new chancellor at UM Western at the November meeting before she was actually working. But now she's working, and this is her first official Regents meeting, so I would like you to all join me in welcoming Chancellor Beth Weatherby from UM Western. Beth?
Welcome aboard. Further announcements. President Cruzado.
Yes. Mr. Chair, members of the board, it's a distinct pleasure for me to share with you that today at 11 a.m. at the Capitol in Helena, there will be a special ceremony celebrating some outstanding Montanans. And one of them, Maurice Hilleman, is a graduate of Montana State University, class of 1941. He graduated #1 in his class, and he went on to become the world's leading vaccinologist. If you have a child and you have received any of the following vaccines, measles, mumps, meningitis, hepatitis A, hepatitis B, and others, all those were discovered by this native of Miles City, Montana, who attended Montana State University and again is credited with saving more lives than any other scientist in the history of the world. We are very proud of Maurice Hilleman.
Outstanding, thank you. Further announcements. Are there further announcements? Seeing none, no more introductions. Commissioner.
Mr. Chair. Not sure I have anything to say after the vaccinologist guy. Pretty impressive. I would like to start the Commissioner's report or my remarks by acknowledging and thanking Governor and Superintendent for being here this morning. You know, I'm often asked how our relationships are by you all, members of the board, members of the MUS community, and I can honestly say in the 10 years I've been part of the Montana University system, I don't think they've ever been stronger. I think our office, the Commissioner's office, works on a daily basis, if not an hourly basis, with Superintendent's office, with the Governor's office. There is, from cell phone chatter to high-level meetings, there's work happening every day. I think it really, truly starts from great leadership from the Governor, who has a keen interest in education, as I think he's demonstrated from pre-K all the way through graduate work and research enterprise that is happening at our campuses. It truly is fun to be a part of. I think the relationships are being well used and are incredibly productive, and I'm proud of the work that's happening across the system based on those relationships and the opportunities that it's creating, from Main Street Montana and the business community introductions that have been made there to the collaborative effort from K on up through the work that we do each and every day. And so I would really like to thank both the superintendent and the governor for their incredible interest in higher education and the support that they give us. On the lines of thanks, you know, we talk about things all the time, and we've sort of started talking about developmental ed and the work that's being done, and Ed Ready in particular as a matter of fact and a matter of course in Montana. It truly is not. I think Montana is on the cusp of doing great things in developmental ed, and I truly believe leading the nation, if not beyond, in those efforts. And I would like to thank both President Engstrom for his work there, but the larger community that has been part of this, John Seck and Bob Curry, the director of Digital Academy, where a lot of this Ed Ready work is being done. I don't think many people know this, but we're asked last fall to go and attend a work session at Oxford and present on the work that is being done in Montana to the rest of the world. And they received high accolades, and I think it is truly remarkable what is happening. When they got back, they were asked to create a white paper, and that has recently been submitted for publication to part of the same Oxford community. And so the work that is being done in Montana is receiving international attention, and I think it is truly remarkable. So I would like to thank all of the individuals that have been involved in that effort that I think started as a campus effort and has grown into a statewide pilot, and now is being supported by Dennis and Phyllis Washington and the Gates Foundation to become what I think will truly be national and international leaders in that event. And that's happening all across Montana through collaborative work on both sides of the divide, and truly great efforts to make this happen on behalf of both President Engstrom and President Cruzado. So I truly am delighted with the work and the movement that is being made. I said this morning at breakfast, I think that holds the key. Developmental ed holds the key to ultimately retention rates, completion rates, cost of education, time to degree, cost of degree. Those things kind of all are embodied in how well that we make that connection with K-12 and how well they make the transition ultimately from high school through our enterprise and into the business and working communities. And so I'm truly appreciative of the work that's being done there. And I want to thank John Seck from my office, which I told you we generally work just on negative reinforcement, but I'm going to break the rules here. I want to thank Deputy Commissioner Seck for the incredible work that he is not only inspiring but helped to lead across the system on developmental ed and Ed Ready and other pieces of it. So John, thank you. So the next item on here is really to have a little discussion about the legislative agenda. I think from a board perspective, if you've got questions we should ask along the way. I think the governor actually did a pretty good job of outlining sort of where we are at this point in time. As all of you probably know, we had our subcommittee meetings a couple weeks ago. Myself, the two presidents, a number of my staff, and then various individuals throughout the system helped present over a course of about 4 days what is the bulk of our MUS budget. And all total with executive action and the rest, I think we were in front of that committee for nearly a week, and I think it was a very, very productive week. One of the certainly sort of themes that grew out of those conversations is what started a couple years ago, and that is a willingness to help fund higher education in Montana if we express and demonstrate a willingness to be open, transparent, and accountable to the state taxpayers for the $500 million that they give us over a biennium. And I think we've certainly demonstrated that we are interested in that. And those relationships, I think, went over the last two sessions from what started as a somewhat, maybe hostile is not the right word, but somewhat of an interesting environment that when we walked in there a few years ago to what is a very cordial relationship when we walked out at the end of this meeting. And I think that comes from good work that's being done by the system and by your staff throughout the system to make sure that we're reaching out. And whether that's a chancellor reaching out in a community to their local legislators or us working with staffers here on the Hill to make sure that they understand what we're doing, they understand the importance of what we're doing, they know that we're open, transparent, and accountable to the dollars they give us. I really, truly think we've made some headway there, and we built some bridges. We managed to get out of the subcommittee with a unanimous vote on full funding of what the governor had put in his budget in terms of present law adjustments, full funding for what the governor had in his budget for our first time ever and quite inspirational research agenda, $15 million. We actually got about $2.6 million of additional funding out of the committee for our extension services throughout the state. And so a very, very positive hearing, I think, in all sort of facets of that conversation. The two areas that we continue to seek support and the governor is bringing forth amendments to help us on is there was a slight reduction in Governor's Best and Brightest Scholarship funding, and some of that was to sort of balance the subcommittee work so they can get to House appropriations at a level that they were supposed to. And we understand that part, and I truly do understand sort of the difficult decisions and situations that our legislators are placed in as they try to assign priorities across the state and the state budget. I get that. But as always, to look a gift horse in the mouth, which I think we can easily do, we take what they gave us and we'll continue to argue for full funding of the scholarship funds as this thing moves forward. And we are continuing to ask for a permanent source of funding for the Havre Biodiesel Center. And I think that the governor is going to support those amendments moving forward, and that would restore basically the budget to everything that was in the governor's budget as introduced, and would add an additional $2.6 million that goes into ag extension and research. And so, in a nutshell, I think we sit pretty good coming out of subcommittee. I think we sit in a spot where we hope to be as we've had conversations about this over the last 6 months, and that is in an advantageous position to likely be able to freeze tuition moving forward. And I say likely because one of the pieces of that is, of course, House Bill 13. That is that we have a fully funded state pay plan. Certainly 76% of our budget is about people. And for all the great things that are happening, they're happening because of the great people that we have in the university system. And we need to be able to continue to recruit and ultimately retain high-level faculty, staff, and administrators to our system. And so, we've said going in, there's no more important piece of this than proper funding levels for our faculty, staff, and administrators, and that is House Bill 13, and that is moving forward, but it is yet to be scheduled in terms of a hearing. They have to be out of the House full approach by the end of March. This is usually the time of year that they do that, and so sometimes they've done it before transmittal, sometimes right after. We expect that that hearing will be coming up soon, and myself and the presidents will be there to support that with as much effort as we can muster, and we have a lot of great partners across the system and across the state that will be there to support it as well. The other, of course, important piece of legislation to us is long-range building. We actually, for all that is read and talk, there's been some posturing. The governor still is incredibly supportive of the bonding bill and the entirety of what he put forward in that package that we're part of. I think he truly appreciates that. He mentioned Romney by name. It is, of course, our top priority. It is a building that I think we truly need to put back into production. But it also is very consistent with the theme of projects that we put forth, and I think the committee understood and appreciated the fact that all of the 5 or 6 projects that we have there have some aspect of taking care of what we already own, taking care of what we already have, taking some deferred maintenance off the books, renovating, bringing up to speed buildings and facilities that cost us significantly. CLAP was mentioned. We have significant asbestos issues in there. The maintenance of that building, the operation of it, is incredibly expensive for us because every time we do anything, we're dealing with those issues. It needs a renovation. And I think the committee, I do believe in the committee hearing we had, they really did appreciate. I had several committee members come up after and say, that's a fresh look for us. We really appreciate that it's not all about the next new project. It's about taking care of what we have and getting some deferred maintenance, which we have a lot of, off of the books. And so, I think we sit in a favorable spot. We passed with all of the projects out of committee with a unanimous vote. Like I started to say earlier, there's, of course, been some posturing as to what will happen, and most of it's centered around bonding and how that debate will end. I don't really know. We have some deferred maintenance money and the Mays extension money now in a second bill that is cash, not bonds. Both of those move forward. There's coordinating language. We won't get both pots of money if they do happen, but it's just going to have to play out. And I really think that some of these major pieces of legislation, and clearly the long-range building plan is one of those, will have their day in the sunshine, but it's going to be as the session moves forward. And ultimately, I think they kind of be part of the grand bargain, which ultimately will bring this journey to a close, hopefully by the 90th day, hopefully by the 85th, 84th, some earlier day, but we'll see. I think we sit in pretty good shape. And I think it's a testament to the work that's been done by your staff, but we're optimistically encouraged, but we know that we are at day 45, so we've only completed the half of the journey, and things change. For as slow as the session moves, things change rather quickly. We'll keep an eye on it, and we'll keep you informed, and we'll know. A couple good things that have happened. Senate Bill 29 has passed and was actually signed in a signing ceremony by the governor last week, which gives us the freedom to manage non-resident enrollment as we have, and I think we've done a great job of that. And I think we demonstrated that. It passed out of, I think, the Senate 49 to 1, and we had a little wave in there, but ultimately passed with flying colors out of the House too, and has been signed by the governor. But that removes some restrictive language that was put in prior to the creation of the Board of Regents and prior to the constitutional changes that have been there, but nonetheless creating some significant issues for us along the way with audit and other bodies of the legislature. And so Taylor Brown carried a bill to correct that, and that is now in the books, and we can manage our non-resident population appropriately. A couple of the things that we watched, we now have created a website or a link on our website, which I would certainly call everyone's attention to, that will track the various legislation pieces that are important to us, and they will give you our stance as a system on whether we support and oppose those, and encourage you to look at those. It also has a link to it that will take you to where you can identify what local legislators in your community, where they stand on it, how they voted on it, whether they're supporting or against. And I certainly encourage you to look at those links and to, whenever possible, make sure that we're encouraging our local delegations to support the greater sort of MUS priority. And I think that that's been helpful already and will continue to be. And so we'll keep up-to-date information on there. The only sort of less than favorable report I have out of the session at this point is the House gun bill 143, I believe, did pass out of the House. It is now waiting. No, sorry, I'm backwards. Passed out of the Senate bill. Passed out of the Senate, is now waiting kind of on the doorsteps of a hearing at the House. I don't know where that goes. We continue to be opposed to it, and we continue to be opposed to it not because we dislike guns or the right to own guns, but because we know, both statistically and intuitively and anecdotally, that our campuses are an incredibly safe place. Everything that you can pull up will tell you, compared to other communities of its size, it is incredibly safe. Not to say that we don't have areas that we continue to work on, but I don't believe as a system we think guns are going to make it safer or better. And it's a little hard, frankly, to imagine guns at the Cat Grizz game in Bozeman next year. And so I continue to actively lobby against that. Although we support the Second Amendment and all the rights that are embodied in that, we think we're doing a great job making opportunities available for students and still having an incredibly safe environment. In fact, some of the gun bills that they point to around the country, like Oregon and Idaho, where they've said, look, they passed a gun bill, that's why we need to. But when you look at those gun bills, they almost mirror Montana Board of Regents policy already. They don't allow guns in classrooms. They don't allow guns in football and basketball stadiums. They don't allow guns in libraries. They allow people to bring guns to campus, to check those into a secure facility, and have them available for whatever they want to do, whether it's hunting or shoot and skeet or target practice. I mean, you name it, we've got the flexibility to do that, and we continue to advocate in that direction. We continue to think the Board of Regents is in control of that in terms of their prerogative to set those priorities, and we think that the board has set them very well. So we'll watch that as it moves forward. Can't really predict where that is going to go. We'll continue to lobby the governor's office to oppose that as well, and we will see. But that, in a nutshell, is the bills that we've been tracking. I think from an appropriation standpoint, we sit exactly where we wanted to be when we set our budget together last fall, and ultimately what came out of the governor's office. And so we will continue to support those as best we can. If you guys have individual questions or thoughts on that, I would be glad to try to answer them or to try to get some of our team to answer them. Somebody's gotten in the Cheetos, I'm just saying. National Cheeto Day. Brian?
Oh, me.
There we go. 2 bags.
Regent Robinson.
I thought you were looking at me there. I'm Cheeto-free today. You had mentioned the House Bill 13, the pay plan, and where that stands right now. Based on the discussions in the hallway and with some of our partners and with some of the legislative body, do you have an idea of if that's going to remain intact moving forward as well, or do you anticipate any type of changes to that?
Regent Robinson, Mr. Chair, that seems to be one of the great questions on the Hill. It actually has received what I would consider in being part of my 5th session now, very little attention so far, and I don't really know what that means, to be honest. It just hasn't had a lot of conversation. There is some conversation about how various agencies spent the money out of last session, and we have been there and present anytime we can to say we spent the money very consistent with what we think the directions were, and that is, we had sort of a pool of money that was appropriate to do about a 3% increase as a state. We had our share of that within the MUS. We worked hard to see, without a tuition increase, that we could match that. They also asked that we would support the lower bands, which we don't really have bands within the MUS, but we do within other state government. But those within the lower structure of the pay plan as best we could. And I think we did that with, as you all know, a $250 plus 2.25% increase both years of the biennium last year, which adds a little bit of a bump to those on the lower end of the pay scale, flattens it a little for those on the upper end, and ultimately left us where, as a system, we spent about 2.9% per person increase, which I think is very consistent, and we continue to remind the legislature that we were very consistent with the directions that they gave us. We did, back to sort of the accountability conversations, I think we did exactly what they expected us to do with the tuition freeze and with the pay plan, and that has been our argument for why we need to see what the governor's proposed in House Bill 13 move forward. And I'm hopeful that when the posturing's done, that it will come out in that end, and we'll be able to move forward with the freeze and be able to move forward with an increase for our associates system-wide. And I think I look favorable, but it's just really kind of too early to tell is part of the answer. There's just a lot of sort of posturing over what happened last session, what's going to happen this session. Did they get their raise? Do they need their raise? Some of those things.
Okay, well, thank you. And I know that you had mentioned it as well, but I think it bears repeating, is that thank you for your efforts and working with our legislators and continuing to provide them with the information that they need at the time that they need it. And thank you and your staff for doing so as well, and as well as our campus leaders for making those efforts for this to hopefully end as we're starting out right here. Thank you.
Thank you, Regent Robinson.
Regent Williams.
I'm curious if you could detail the relationship. I know we have a lot of students up in Helena lobbying on behalf of students or different campuses, and I was hoping that you could allude to how that relationship is going and how those students are helping to move along different items.
Absolutely. I mean, in the end, this is all about the state funding students, right? And that is a key piece, and it's certainly not lost on the legislature. The students are there every day. They attend with my entire staff 11 o'clock meeting every day to discuss bill tracking and ultimately how we're working all these bills. They're a part of that on a day-to-day basis, and they're working hard in the hallways. And I mean, frankly, they probably carried the majority of the load, students and business leaders, in our committee hearings in front of subcommittee. I think the subcommittee represents a broad spectrum of taxpayers across Montana, and they want to hear from those that we're serving, which is ultimately the business community, the economy of Montana, and the students that fill those seats. And they did a fantastic job of doing that, and will continue to be an important part of sort of our legislative strategy moving forward. I think, and I don't know if Ace is here, but there is a student day coming up at the Capitol. Tomorrow. I knew it was Friday, but I thought it was next Friday. Tomorrow. So I don't know if you can speak to that, Mariah, or if we want Asa to, but be glad to just hear a little bit about that for board members. That's going to be an important day, and I think it'll have a tremendous impact on the legislature.
I think so too. That's been a great collaboration. I think that somebody might be able to, we have the ASMSU student lobbyist who can tell us more about that, I think.
Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you, Chair Tuss. Mr. Commissioner, I'm just here to actually introduce ASMSU's lobbyist, Garrett Langford, and I hope he's going to be able to tell you all a bit about probably the work he's doing up there and the lobby day that is happening tomorrow.
Hey, all. Thanks for having me, Mr. Chair, members. So tomorrow is our lobby day, and we're expecting about 30 to 40 students to come from across the state, and that includes MSU, Tech, Western. We wanted to make it inclusive of all students just because when the students lobby together, myself, my counterpart, and then we have a Montana Associated Students lobbyist, we lobby as a team, and so we lobby on behalf of all 40,000 students in the university system, so we really wanted to ensure that all of our students were accounted for and had representation here on Friday. We're really excited tomorrow to show what students have done and to show what we've been working on. We have some really great student-led initiatives and great student bills that we're tracking with student debt reform, tuition freeze. You know, we work with the commissioner's office, but we have some projects that we're working on ourselves. So I invite you guys all to join us on tomorrow, I guess, and go Bobcats. Yeah.
Regent Albrecht.
Chair Tuss, I would like to encourage you all to ensure that you are also taking a very serious look at Senate Bill 143 with the concealed weapons on campus. I think that as the legislature passes this by in the wink of an eye, it's unfortunate that folks throughout our communities are not taking a closer look at what's going on in our legislature and reaching out to their legislators, because I think that there are some potential dire consequences with this, not only for looking at ensuring the safety of our campuses, but also the perception of the safety or the issues of perception, especially as folks are looking at sending their students to college, and the concern of if concealed weapons are allowed on our campuses. It's not an appropriate place, and I am so pleased that we are making sure that that is a priority, that we are not in favor of that bill. I would ask you all to take a very close look at that and to have your voices heard.
Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. Thank you for doing what you're doing and being part of the MUS team.
Are there further questions of the commissioner about our legislative agenda? Are there further questions? Seeing none, do you want to continue, Commissioner?
Sure. The last thing I would say, Regent Williams, about our students is, as Governor Bullock alluded to earlier, I'm just continue to be floored by the work that our students do all across the MUS, whether it's wandering in a lab or the students that represent all of the MUS in Helena. It's impressive. It truly is amazing. I often wonder what it was that we all did when we attended, because it doesn't seem like what it is today. But yeah, I know it is when Paul and Kevin McCrae attended, but that was a different deal. But it truly is impressive, and it's reflective of the incredible faculty that we have across the system, and we'll continue to work hard to do what we can to see that those faculty get properly compensated as we move forward with this agenda, and that we get the funding that I think Montana intends and the MUS needs to make sure that we continue to serve the needs of Montana. I think we made a good case for why this is a unique opportunity for the state to actually invest dollars in Montana. It's not purely an expense, which most of what the legislature does is an expense. We turn a limited investment by the state, $250 million, into a $1.5 billion business, and that there is what leverage is all about, and that's growing the economy for Montana, and it's making incredible opportunities for the individuals that participate. I think people get that. I think the legislature gets that. I think the subcommittee got it, and we'll continue to try to work to the 90th day to see we can get as much funding for the system as possible. So, Mr. Chair, we would then move to something that we briefly touched on earlier, which is College Application Week. It's actually something that sort of spawned out of this ACT funding grant. It was a small piece of it, but it is growing into an incredible piece. And I won't steal the thunder, but Superintendent Juneau mentioned a few of those statistics, and I've asked Zach to come share with us sort of what's happening on this front. The number of students that said they learned something that they didn't know, and they helped navigate the process that they maybe otherwise wouldn't have, and the 20-some% of students that applied for college that said otherwise they wouldn't have is truly remarkable, and I think it's going to create some opportunities. And I said earlier, it sort of was an offshoot that is growing into something that is incredibly productive, and we're seeing some rewards for them. So we asked the director to come share with us some of what is going on. This is a project that's administered through Gear Up and is part of ACT. And so, Zach, if you would share with us, that'd be pleased.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner Christian, Chairman Tuss, and board members for having me here today. And I can't help but, the governor mentioned earlier that he felt a little bit inadequate, and I have to say that I think it's just a little bit unfortunate that I am talking about College Application Week in Montana against the backdrop of National Cheeto Day. So, but at any rate, the Superintendent Juneau did reference this initiative earlier a little bit and talked about some of the numbers and statistics. I would like to provide just a little bit of a historical context of this initiative and kind of where we are in Montana against the nation. If we could have the next page, please. This started in 2005 in North Carolina, and it was actually just a handful of high schools that said, you know, maybe we could get together, we could provide some structured time in our schools to help students, all students, you know, complete college applications, help them navigate some of those difficult aspects of an application that the average high school student might struggle with a little bit. And they partnered with some post-secondary institutions and held the first sort of college application week in just a small pocket of Appalachia, North Carolina. But that was in 2005, and in 2014, every state in the nation, as well as the District of Columbia, had some type of college application week initiative or a pilot initiative. So I think that's exciting, and I think it's exciting that Montana is moving forward with the rest of the nation on this initiative. There's two basic premises behind College Application Week. The first is that you know, low-income students, that the application fee can be a barrier for them and their family to take that step of submitting an application to a campus. And the second premise is that all high school students, just based on the nature of being a teenager and a high school student, many students obviously are involved in, you know, extracurricular activities, they're involved in community things, they're involved in church groups. Many high school students have jobs. And so finding time at home in the evening or whenever on a weekend to actually get that done, regardless of whether or not the application fee is a financial obstacle, can prevent students from submitting an application. So it was these dual ideas that this would reduce a barrier for low-income students, but also provide support for all students to complete and submit a college application was the idea behind this initiative being written into the grant application in 2011 that was awarded to the Commissioner's office. And again, you heard Superintendent Juneau, you heard Commissioner Christian talk about some of those statistics. Basically, in the second full year of statewide implementation of this initiative, we grew it by about 1,000 students. And one other statistic I would share is that 2,736 high school seniors who submitted an application during the week represents about 1/4 of all the high school seniors in the state of Montana, which I think is significant. We had 136 high schools sign up. We will keep on trying to get, you know, we would like to see every high school in Montana be a part of this initiative, and that will be something that drives us going forward. Initially, Additionally, I think it's significant that in 2014, we had every single post-secondary institution in the state of Montana participated in this initiative. So a high school student could submit to any MUS 2-year private community college or tribal institution that they wanted to submit an application to in 2014. So I'd want to thank all the campus leaders that are here today for your support of that. Just going forward, we look forward to continuing this initiative. As I mentioned, we want to get more high schools involved. I think in my work with the work group, which includes representatives from campus admissions, representatives from the Montana College Access Network, our colleagues in Montana Trio, and all the counselors out there that are doing the amazing work, that we want to keep engaging them and talking about how we can make this initiative better. One of the challenges, quite frankly, is the communication between post-secondary institutions and the site coordinators at the high schools that are doing this work. I think we improved that communication vastly in 2014, and I think it will be even better in 2015. And I will be engaging all stakeholders to continue to grow this initiative and move the needle forward. And as was mentioned, I think the 23% of students that indicated that they had not planned on submitting a college application is significant, and the 82% that said that this really helped them understand the process and understand next steps, even more importantly. And so we will be continuing with this initiative, and we're very excited about it. And I think in closing, I would just say that this is a great example of what happens when different stakeholders in the college access community communicate and work together and keep their eye on the prize, which is increasing college enrollment in the state of Montana and growing a college-going culture. So again, thank you. And if you would like to know a little bit more about this initiative, you're always welcome to visit our website, which is www.mus/gearup. And there is a link on that page to the full report and also to our College Application Week page. So thank you.
Thank you. I think we have a couple of questions for you, if you don't mind staying at the podium. One of my questions has to do with the funding for this. I like the collaboration that you described, but I'm a little fuzzy about the funding. Is there really any funding associated with this, or is this more of just a collaborative effort of various agencies coming together to make it happen?
There's not a significant amount of funding. Obviously, the staff time associated with it comes out of our personnel services in our Gear Up grant. We do get a little bit of funding from the Student Assistance Foundation, and they basically give us promotional materials that we send out to high schools who are hosting the initiative. And then obviously, campuses are providing some funding in the fact that they're either deferring or waiving these application fees. But that's really the only significant funding associated with this.
Or the next step then, are the application fees, is that a hurdle? I mean, have you discovered that the next step, to applying to various colleges would be a hurdle? And I'm wondering whether or not other states have kind of taken that next step to fund that piece of the process.
I don't know specifics of what other states are doing. I think one of the things that we've talked about is for those students that are low income, when they actually enroll in the campus, and when they step onto campus in the fall, that fee could potentially be deferred. And I think just in general around the country, these initiatives look a little bit different. But to answer your question directly, I'm not aware of any states that are directly funding application fees for all students, if that's what you're asking.
Yeah, thank you. Regent Sheehy.
Does this occur in the same week at all 136 schools?
Yes, yeah. This last year, it was the first week of November. We may look at moving it to the last week of October or even a little earlier. That is some of the feedback that we've gotten from high schools and from campuses, that if we could move it a little bit earlier, it would be beneficial. But yes, it is. It's 1 week. The high schools sign up, and it happens during that week. And I think again, it's significant because it is statewide, and it's a time when all high schools are really looking at that piece of college access.
Does it look different in the 136 different schools, or is there a template that they all follow?
It looks different. Really all that they have to commit to is providing structured time sometime during that week for students to submit the application. So some of them might do it in an event in the evening, invite parents. Some of them might just do it in their English class or senior government class. Some of them might, we have a toolkit that we distribute out that has a lot of ideas, like trying to enlist community volunteers, trying to reach out to maybe some campuses that are in your neck of the woods and asking people from those campuses to come and help students, because we obviously don't want them to sway the students to go to their campus necessarily, but we know that it brings value in terms of bringing that college awareness piece to the initiative.
And it looks like it's too early to get data regarding whether the increase in applications from this week result in an increase in attendance at our colleges. But is that something that you're looking to do in the future, is track that data?
Yes, we have had some preliminary conversations about that. And this year we do have the student identification numbers of those students. So we are in some early conversations about how we might look at tracking those students.
I'm particularly interested in the quarter, or 25% almost, who say they wouldn't have applied otherwise. It'd be interesting to know what happens to those kids.
Yeah.
And what we can do if they're moving forward into our system.
Yeah.
To keep them there.
Yeah.
This looks like a whole bunch of data to me that we could collect, Tyler.
Okay.
So as we move forward, I'll be interested to see what else we can learn from this.
Yeah, I agree.
Thank you, Regent Sheehy. Regent Williams?
Thank you for being here. I just am curious, either data-driven or anecdotally, I'm curious, what is in your opinion, the biggest barrier to those students, that 23% that wouldn't have applied otherwise, the biggest barrier to them pushing send on those applications?
Well, I think a couple things. I think this process is daunting for students, just in the fact that there's a lot of information that they have to get together and submit, and a lot of times they don't know before they start what they need. And one of the best practices that's actually highlighted in this report is really, again, with that structured support for students to have all the information they need before they start the application process, because if they do that, it's actually a pretty simple process. And most of our campuses that participated this year took online applications. So again, it can be, it can probably be done in 40 minutes if you have everything that you need. So I think just, knowing what information you need, knowing where to get that information, I think for high school students that might not have support can be a little bit daunting. And I think just by nature, many teenagers, and I did used to be a classroom teacher, so I do know this, many teenagers are procrastinators. And so, and the more you procrastinate, the more that becomes a barrier. So I think just having that happen, and I also went to one of our pilot events in 2012 in Lincoln, and a parent expressed that very thing, like, this is just such a relief that we've got this step out of the way, and now we can focus on the next step. So I guess in my opinion, those are some of the barriers and why this initiative helps with those.
Thank you.
Are there further questions from the board? Seeing none. Thank you very much. This is an important initiative. Thank you. Commissioner?
Mr. Chair, members of the board, we have the campus reports are posted. I know they're of interest to us all. well, we haven't been going through them of late, and so continuing with that, I think, Mr. Chair, we're ready to move on to the reauthorization presentation unless somebody has specific questions that they wanted to ask with regard to the campus presentations.
Seeing none, I think we can move on.
Okay. Mr. Chair, members of the committee, as you know, I have the pleasure to serve on the WICHE committee as well. And the other meeting, we were in Boulder, and we had the opportunity to discuss Higher Education Reauthorization Act. In my opinion, no one does a better job than the WICHE president, David Longenecker, and so we asked David if he would come up and share his thoughts with us and some insight that he has. This is sort of one of those areas in terms of board education that we think it's important that you all have some understanding of what it is and what is happening at the federal level. Sometimes I can't decide if we're a part of that, not a part of that, how we fit in or where we do and we don't, but I think Mr. Longenecker can shed some light on that, and we're very pleased to have him. David has been how many years at WICHE now? 15. Does an incredible job as a policymaker there and is truly leading the nation and certainly the Western United States forward. And so, David, thank you for joining us and welcome.
Great, and thank you very much. And thanks for the invitation. It's always great to be in Montana, and it's particularly both great and an honor and a privilege to be before you here today, and to be here on the Helena college campus. I was noticing the Phi Theta Kappa thing there. I was never Phi Beta Kappa because I was a transfer student. Well, I probably wouldn't have been eligible anyway, but transfer students aren't eligible. But I was in Phi Theta Kappa from Wenatchee Valley College in Wenatchee, Washington. So it's great to be on this campus. I'm going to talk to you about the federal role. In order to talk about where things are going now or likely to go with reauthorization of the Higher Education Act, I think it's really important to have a sense of how the federal government got to its current federal role in post-secondary education. And so I'm going to give you what I call the brief history of that, of everything you'd want to know about that. And then I'll talk a bit about what I think that means for reauthorization of the Act, of the Higher Education Act as we go forward. So, in the beginning, there was a Constitution. And the Constitution in the 10th Amendment says the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So, that, of course, has led to our sort of mantra in education, higher education and elementary and secondary education, that higher education is not a federal responsibility. That it is a state responsibility. So if that's the case, why is the federal government so actively involved in our business, if you will? Well, there are a couple of reasons for that. But it's very important to start with an understanding that while we think of it as a state responsibility, initially it wasn't even a state responsibility. At least higher education was not. Initially, as our country was evolving, higher education was an elitist, non-governmental system designed to educate the elite. And if you read John Adams or others, that was as it was appropriate. I mean, that's the way it was supposed to be. A few were to be educated at the highest levels, and that was about what they believed could benefit from such. So that really guided, I mean, the federal government was not at all involved in post-secondary education as it initially began and evolved. But in the middle of the 19th century, that all changed with the Morrill Act. And it wasn't because it was a federal responsibility, but because at that time there was perceived to be a very substantial federal interest and a need. We were really very actively involved in the agricultural revolution, industrial revolution, and things were changing greatly. There was a need for a much better educated populace and a recognition that there were others who could benefit from that. Now, in a similar presentation, as Clay mentioned, I presented to the commissioners one of the beauties and dilemmas of being the head of the Chief of Staff of the Witchy Commission is that I have 45 commissioners who are very smart and very well educated. And so the one who was a professor of political science came up to me afterwards and corrected some of my, what he didn't correct, but he said one of the things I'd left out is that the Land Grant Act passed, and I sort of said it was because of this federal interest and national need. I think that's what most everybody would agree. But it was also true at that time that the United States was engaged in a great battle, and that the U.S. Congress at that time was basically the North. The South was absent. And if you've read the discussions between Hamilton and Madison and all of those things, basically the North was more comfortable with the federal government being engaged in things, and the South was less comfortable. And had the South been a part of the Congress, there's a chance they would have cried foul, and that the Commerce Act would have prevented them from considering the Land Grant Act. But they were off busy doing other things, and so the Land Grant Act was passed in 1862. But it's really important to understand that wasn't done for the sake of the citizens of the United States. It was done as a national economic imperative. It was because the nation really needed more educated. And it began what I would say it moved from an elitist to a meritocratic system of higher education. A lot of talk, we talk now about the great Land Grant College Act and how it opened higher education to the masses. It really was designed for the sons, not so much the sons and daughters, the sons, mechanics and farmers who could benefit from that education and could benefit the society. So it was still a very meritocratic system. Nobody ever was talking about a lot of people going on. It was the best and the brightest of all classes should be going on. And that was also about the time when we sort of invented the idea of a scholarship for the most able. And so if you think about what scholarship meant, and particularly what it meant up until just recent times, it was something that the best and the brightest should be able to get to go to college. But again, to the end of that was really economic development for the population. So that was sort of the lay of the land until about the middle of the 20th century, when broad access became a public goal at both the federal and the state levels. But again, it's important to keep in mind that began not as something that was good for the citizens of the state or the country. It was, again, an economic development. We talk a lot about the GI Bill and how it was designed to provide great opportunities for these wonderful GIs returning. In fact, it was an economic development bill. It was intended to do, it was sort of a twofer in a neat way. What it was is there was a realization that if the GIs all came back and all tried to go back into the workforce, that it would force us back into the Great Depression. That there simply wasn't an economic engine at that point capable of absorbing that large mass to come back. Plus, if we sent them to college, they'd get greater skills and be able to help promote that economic engine. So in a major way, the GI Bill was as much an economic development as it was a reward for those people who had served their country so heroically. The next major effort was the National Defense Education Act. It, again, was economic development, or one could say national security almost. It was designed because the Russians had sent Sputnik up and had beaten us into space. And there was a great deal of concern that we were losing our edge as a leader to those communist Ruskies. And so we had to do something to catch up. It really wasn't until the Higher Education Act of 1965, which was one of the great programs of one of the programs of the Great Society, put forth initially by President Kennedy as an idea and then really carried by President Johnson, that the federal government actually created a program that was for the people. This one wasn't an economic development program. It was one that was designed to essentially enhance the opportunities of those people in America who could benefit from higher education but simply couldn't afford to go. So this one moved beyond that federal interest to a federal responsibility, I served as was mentioned, as the Assistant Secretary for Post-Secondary Education for a number of years, and as I looked at the history of this, it was really sort of came out, if you look at the rhetoric that was at that time, they were talking about this as now a federal responsibility as embedded in the 14th Amendment, because you couldn't really have the opportunities to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in the modern society without being well educated. And so that became a really different thrust for the federal government as we moved from elitist to meritocratic, as we had done earlier. We were now moving from a meritocratic to an egalitarian perspective on post-secondary education. And so the nature of that was primarily, the biggest piece of that was then and remains today, the need-based financial aid program, initially known as the Basic Educational Opportunity Program, the BOG, or BOGS, which actually had originally been in the bill as a grant to institutions called the Educational Opportunity Grants. But after 5 years, they decided the institutions, they didn't like the way they were being distributed, so they made them, for all practical purposes, a voucher known as the BEOG, which was later named the Pell Grant after Claiborne Pell, who was a senator who had been a major champion for the Higher Education Act. And there's a long story behind that, but we won't go into that. Now, that federal effort was also being matched at the same time in the 1960s, early 1970s, by a huge effort that I refer to as a national movement, but by that I mean the states were engaged in the same activity toward this egalitarian policy. And it was reflected in trying to provide higher education geographic access. So in Montana, you have institutions that were, to a great extent, created or expanded substantially during that period of time to reach out to make sure that people throughout the state would have access to post-secondary education. That time, we didn't have the same approach to distance education as we have today. We didn't have the internet. Al Gore hadn't invented that yet. So we really talked about geographic access. We also talked about making college tuition as free as possible at the state level. And we had state need-based financial aid efforts to a great extent because the federal government had provided a strong incentive for the states to develop that as part of the Higher Education Act. But the most significant part of that was the two-year college or community college movement, which really radically changed access to higher education in America during that period of time. Sure, there had been community colleges before the 1960s, but it was really, to a great extent, the master plan in California that drove many other states to the development of the community colleges to the point where today about 1 out of every 2 students, undergraduate students in America, are in a community college. I think it's around 44%, something like that, are in a community college. Prior to 1960, very few people went to college. And initially, that Higher Education Act at the federal level had a very clear goal. It was to make higher education financially possible for Americans to go to college if they were able to benefit from that effort. And the strategy, the ways that they were going to do that, was also very clear. We were going to give grants to the most needy students. We were going to give loans to the middle class to make it, for them, it was less of a barrier than a burden, so we're going to try to reduce the burden. And we wouldn't be foolish enough to give money to the non-needy students who didn't really need it. That was the set of objectives coming out of the Higher Education Act. And it worked. Enrollment increased dramatically during that decade or 2 decades following implementation of the Higher Education Act. At the implementation of the Higher Education Act, about 1/3 of high school graduates went on to some form of post-secondary education within a couple of years of high school graduation. Today, 1/3 of high school graduates don't go on to college within a couple of years of high school graduation. So they've really reversed, and during that 50 years, we've radically changed the extent to which higher education serves our population. although there are some who would argue that it may not have been entirely the federal government that did this. I mentioned that at that same time, the states were radically increasing access and opportunity. So it wasn't just that the demand was increasing, the supply was also increasing. And I can personally attest to the fact of another thing called the draft. If you were a young male in 1964 graduating from high school, which is when I graduated, you wanted to go to college because you did have another alternative. And it wasn't necessarily a very attractive one. And you also stayed in college and went full-time because if you went part-time, you were also eligible for the draft. And so that changed radically the way young men looked at post-secondary education. We didn't take it easy, and we didn't because there was a strong incentive not to do so. And that did change the behavior of people. But let's just, for the sake of the argument, believe that the the Higher Education Act worked. So, if we're still going, and you'll see that basically I think it worked. I think it was a huge change in federal policy that made a huge benefit for America. But I would argue that since then what we've had is really 50 years of incremental creep. I'm going to give you how we got to where we are today from that very clear message in 1965 to a much more muddled message at the federal level today. The first wave of reform was called the Middle Income Student Assistance Act, and it occurred basically started discussions in 1978 and was adopted, I think, in 1980. And it was really focused on expanding opportunity to the middle class. Now, I would tell you, there was no research to support the need for this. All the research then and now shows that students from low-income families have what is called, they have a high price elasticity, there's a high price elasticity of demand for them. That is, if it's they are very sensitive to price in terms of going to college. If they don't get aid, they don't go. Middle income students go to college or they don't, but it's not based on price. They may choose a different college based on price, but they will go to college pretty much if they plan to, regardless of the price. And upper income students go wherever and do whatever they will. The research is really quite clear on that. However, whether these policies worked in the early 1980s depends on one's perspective. They worked if your idea was to have a popular political idea. Middle-class people vote, and they like the idea of supporting people who were doing things that helped them. So that was popular. And in the authorizing programs at the federal level, they were very popular. So you had the authorizing committees radically increasing access to the programs so that middle-income students would be eligible, and radically increasing the amount of money. So you had the authorized level for Pell Grants going up very rapidly, and the way that program is designed, that also brought in many, many middle-income students, because as you increase the maximum, the way the formula works, it brings in less needy, more middle-class students. And that was really popular, and so those were going up. But then the bill would be sent to the appropriations committees, and there was no more money. And so they did rationing within the programs. And the rationing had the effect of maintaining the cost, but it also meant that they were taking funds from the least needy students to give to more of the middle-income students because of the rationing that they did. And that really was the second wave of reform, which was helping the middle income at the expense of the most needy students. So in real terms, what happened at that period of time, you had much expansion of eligibility, particularly in the loan programs, and the funding for that became very, started to erode the funding for other programs, particularly the Pell Grant programs. So you saw the maximum Pell Grants were basically frozen at a period of time when inflation was really quite high during the 1980s, and students were losing a great deal in terms of the value of what the Pell Grant would receive. That was partly because the expense of the loan programs was increasing a lot at that time, which led then to the third wave of reform, which really was in the early 1990s. And it was focused less on how to help more students or how to do whatever. It was really focused on improving the programs. The programs have been around for then a quarter of a century, and you could start to see the warts in the programs. And so there was a lot of focus on saying, well, let's see what we can do to make these programs work better. You'll remember the 1990s were sort of the big beginnings of the accountability era in higher education at the state level and at the federal level. So it wasn't unusual to see program improvement as a theme in that accountability era. And so one of those was direct lending, which was, there was a perception that the existing bank-based lending program was awfully expensive and not very effective for the students. And so you had the invention of direct lending to try to improve the delivery of services and reduce the cost of the program. You had lots of accountability efforts, and this will sound a little familiar. You had the federal government turning to the states to improve their oversight of institutions. Much as we're now looking at the state authorization reciprocity program, there was something called the state post-secondary review entities at that period of time, later to go away. But there was also a huge focus on the huge increase in defaults that had occurred. This was the period of time I was working at the federal level, and we had a major effort to reduce the default rates, and we reduced them from 21% to 10% in 4 years. And we did that by kicking a whole bunch of schools out of the guaranteed student loan program. But there was a mixed bag on the results of this, which then led to, I think, the second part of this third wave of reform, which was really to give even more to the middle class. And I actually was a part of this too. I'm not necessarily as proud of that as some of the other things, but a huge portion of that was the new tuition tax credits, which were made available to students. Now about the same amount of money goes into tuition tax credits as to Pell Grants, going primarily to students who would have gone to college, whether they received it or not, but it was very popular. And I can make the case for why it made sense at the time as well. But it was on top of a huge number of other tax benefits that had benefited higher education at the federal level. So this was a period of, these were the go-go years when there was a lot of money available. Higher education costs were going up, higher education access was going up, lots of good things were happening, and that was sort of that way. At the state level, what we had at that time, again focused on the middle class, was the evolution of a number of merit-based financial aid programs. There was much less focus. Everybody said the poor are taken care of, now we have to focus on the middle class. And that all led to the fourth wave of reform, which was at the beginning of this century in the first decade, which was really focused around increasing the Pell Grant program. Just to give you an idea, most people have no idea how much the Pell Grant program increased during that period of time. But in 1999, the Pell Grant program served 4 million students, and it cost $9 million. Today, it serves 9 million students and costs $35 billion. I'm talking like I was in the state instead of the federal government. From $9 billion to $35 billion over 13 years. A huge increase in the cost of the Pell Grant program. Part of that was the expansion of benefits to a much larger share of the population income-wise. Part of it was the effect of 2 recessions. And part of it was the radical expansion of education offered in the for-profit sector of higher education. Currently, about 9% of the students in the country attend for-profit institutions. About 25 to 33%, depending on which programs you're talking about, of the benefits in federal programs go to students in the for-profit sector. We had this sort of sense during that period of time in early 2000 that more was better and never enough, and we should just keep putting that in there. And that deregulation would foster innovation. I'm a big fan of innovation, and I think it's radically improving the way in which we can provide higher education, but we need to be careful, because an awful lot of the things that are being couched in terms of innovation today are just ways for some people to get more money. Now, how effective were those programs in the first decade of this century? Well, again, it depends on one's perspective. I don't think they worked at all. We didn't see participation rates go up very much at all during that period of time. They had gone up radically beforehand, but they sort of had stabilized at that point. All of which I think has led us to a point, and I am very optimistic about where we are right now. I don't think that was a very successful venture, but I think as I talk to the people at the federal level, what they're focused on now are things that I think could very much complement what you folks are interested in achieving, what our country needs. And one is we're moving from a philosophy of providing greater access to providing greater access, but to have that access be access to success. The completion agenda that you guys have talked so much about is now the agenda. It's not whether students can go to college, it's whether they can go to college and complete their college. And that at the federal level is as aggressive an agenda as it is at the state level. Also, much of the focus is going to be that has to be done in a vein that is affordable. And not just affordable to students, but affordable to the states and to all of the others. Very often in the past, those who were student advocates didn't recognize that there are constraints on the public purse, and that we can only afford so much, so we have to be parsimonious in the way in which we do, and smart in the way in which we do things. And that is much more discussion at the federal level in the committees and at the Department of Education than I've heard in the past. I believe this is the movement of the new millennium, that we will be working on ways to provide strong support for a completion agenda, but in an affordability environment. It's what I say we're moving now from a meritocratic or from an egalitarian system to what I think is really an essentialist system. You cannot expect as a young person that you will be successful as an adult unless you consider getting a post-secondary credential, either a high-value certificate or a degree. Almost all the research suggests that. Now, there'll be a few exceptions. I mean, LeBron James does just fine, but there aren't very many LeBron James. And so most students, most regular people, people like me, like many of you, we're going to have to get a college education if we want to get ahead in life. So it is essential for individuals, and it's essential for our economy that we do that. So I think we've got an essentialist agenda ahead of us, but we don't have unlimited resources to get there. So I've talked about access that becomes access to success. That'll be a major theme. As I talk to people at the federal level, that's what they're talking about. I'll mention a couple of ways they're talking about that in a minute. Need is redefined and reemphasized. I think we don't have an infinite number, so we will have to be more targeted in things because our resources are constrained. We can't continue that growth in the Pell Grant program, as nice as it was for the people who got it, was an unsustainable level of growth. You can't be growing at those levels. What I hear people at the federal level talking about is that all of the actors will have a stake in the game in different ways than it is today. When I talk to feds, they say, today, we're all partners. We give, you take. That's the partnership from their perspective. What they're talking about is that we'll continue to give, but we expect you to give as well. And I think it's fair to presume there won't be a lot of additional tax revenue. I don't know, well, I do know about Montana. The states with which I work aren't real keen on new taxes for themselves or at the federal level. So I think we're going to have to find ways in which we can make this a set of smarter decisions, and it's possible to do. Here are the themes that I hear people talking about as smart federal policy. One is having more transparency in the federal programs. Do people know about the programs? It's surprising when you do surveys of students or prospective students how few of them know that they will be eligible for Pell Grants. The kind of things that you guys were just talking about college night, that can be extremely helpful because people don't know. What they see on television is an investment firm trying to scare wealthy people into saving with them for their children's education because it's going to be so expensive. There's a lot of things we do to make it affordable for people to go to college, but many, particularly those people who don't have a sophisticated knowledge of markets and how things work, don't know that those opportunities avail. So transparency is very keen on the federal agenda. And can consumers, well, that's the same thing. that then can our various partners, the federal government, the institutions, the states, and others, can they buy into whatever it is that the federal government is doing it? And is there room for them to complement it? I talk a lot with states about how their programs could be designed smarter to take advantage of the federal programs. Well, wouldn't it be cool if you didn't have to take advantage of them, if you were actually an integral and thoughtful partner with them on the programs? And can they be implemented in an efficient and effective way? Lots of times we talk about things that are great ideas, but they simply aren't sustainable on the face of it. And is the effort sufficient to achieve the objective? There's no reason throwing good money after bad. We should have programs that work, and can we afford it? So that's where a lot of the themes are that are coming. Here's where the federal government, when I'm talking to them, are talking about the kinds of partnerships. When they're looking at the states, there actually is, I think, the original Higher Education Act was designed to protect students from bad states. Particularly the South, to be honest. It was that basically there was a sense, this was an egalitarian effort to say that there are states that will not protect their citizens. We need to protect the opportunity for them to go to college, and that's what the Higher Education Act to some extent was created to do. I think there's a sense now that if states want to be bad actors, that's their prerogative, that we'll try to protect, help those states that protect their students, because we don't have enough money to buy out the bad states. So I think we'll see some effort in that regard. In fact, there's a major set of discussions that they may reinstitute an intentional state-federal partnership that was similar, originally one of the most successful programs. It's no longer existing because it didn't continue to be so successful. Well, there was a program as part of the Higher Education Act called the State Student Incentive Grant Program, which provided money, matched money with the state to provide grants for students, need-based grants for students. It turned out to be not as, it was a great program designed for getting people out of the starting line, but not to keep them on the race. So it was eliminated eventually. But there's a lot of talk about trying to provide some funding that would incentivize states to keep college more affordable. That's the major theme there. It's not telling you to keep your tuition down. It's not telling you to give more financial aid. It would be working with you to use your various forms of financing to keep college more affordable. There's a lot of discussion about trying to make the loans in particular, but maybe the grants as well, as potential partners with the states, so that the states might be able to buy down some of the loans in a fashion that if the students stayed in state or for one reason or another. Those initiatives have not, in general, focused on institutions as much as they've worked on states. There is a lot of discussion, though, about the role of states in this or institutions in this partnership. And what I hear people talking about is that the institutions should have some skin in the game as well. One of those is that institutions should share in the default risk on loans. So institutions with a low default rate would be essentially sort of skipped over. You'd get a reward for having a low default rate, but if you had a higher default rate, you'd share in some of the costs associated with those defaults. Institutions should share in the benefits of completion. So if your institution had a high completion rate, then you might be eligible as an institution for a greater share of some of the resources that are available to institution-based programs like the supplemental educational opportunity grants or the college work study programs, or potentially even in that state sharing program. And there's a real interest in being beware of greed. And the theme here is basically, this is really focused around the proprietary schools. They generally all begin by doing well, by doing good. That's their general theme. They believe they can be strong educational institutions, and then they realize they can do pretty well by this financially. And then they really move to a new philosophy, sort of buyer beware, and you see a lot of their stuff sounds like that. And then they become greedy, and I'm being fairly candid here. And And it has led to a very sort of accountability-oriented, regulatory-oriented interest in that area. And I'm not saying the federal government will necessarily go that way. That's where the Department of Education is. Senator Alexander, who's a very smart and now even more influential senator, is very keen on deregulating higher education. But I think all of them are keenly aware of the potential dangers of students who can be taken advantage of by certain institutions. Now, they also envision a role for the students in this, too. I've talked about where the feds are looking at the states, where the feds are looking at institutions, but they're also looking at students to make sure that students have some skin in the game as well. And they're looking at sort of some rational approaches to risk sharing with the students. The most obvious of this is the income contingent repayment program in the student loan area. And their philosophy there, and they really, really like that, because their philosophy there is that it allows the students to pay back and over a period of time, and they're more likely to get the full repayment. And so it's better for the student who can afford it because of the variations in their income, but it's also better for the federal government in the long run because they are more likely to recover the full amount of the loan. They're also talking about redefining the FTE. It was really the federal government that seduced us into believing that a student who took 12 hours was somehow a full-time student. We used to think a full-time student was a 15-hour student. That's because we had a 4-year curriculum, and 30 hours a year led to 120 hours and led to graduation. But the federal government, to be lenient and to be benevolent, essentially said, well, sometimes students drop a course and we don't want them to lose their federal Pell Grant, so we'll redefine federal as 12 hours. The result has been that now students think going 12 hours are somehow going to graduate in 4 years. Math isn't that tough, but they don't do it. And so there's an effort at the federal level to redefine the FTE as 15 credit hours and to provide completion bonuses to students for completing on time, and with a particular bonus for completing, for participating at 15 credit hours. I also think there's a chance that they'll redefine the expected family contribution. Many of us who work in the area really believe that that's an area that needs to be rethought, that the concepts that were developed in 1960 for that really need to be made more contemporary. And then in addition to what the talk is about the states and the institutions and the students, there's a lot of discussion about how the federal government could actually be a better partner in this as well. One of those, and you're starting to see this already, is more federal coordination within the Congress, between the authorizing committees, the appropriations committees, and the tax policy committees. When I worked at the federal level, the people working on tax policy had no idea what the federal education programs were or how their programs might interface with that. Today you see at the department level much more interaction between Treasury, the Department of Education, the Department of Labor, on all the kinds of programs that your institutions are engaged in. And at the Congress level you see much more discussions between them on how their policies interact. And you're also seeing that between the departments, as I just mentioned. So all of that is to suggest, I believe, that what you'll see coming out of this Federal Higher Education Act discussions, and if you look at the literature that's being written on this and the ideas today, anything you can imagine is being proposed. But I think where it sort of starts to come together is there is a general sense that we could be a lot smarter in the way in which our programs work, but we won't necessarily be smarter coming out of this discussion. It depends on essentially how that goes forward. You could also see it be more regulatory. The department has certainly moved in that direction with gainful employment and some of their activities, but Secretary Alexander, I don't think is going to move in that direction, so I wouldn't think it's going to end up more regulatory. We could continue to follow this 50 years of incremental reform. In fact, that's always the best bet. A little change is always a better bet than suspecting big change. But we also know where that will lead. Basically, we'll have more of the same, just a little bit different. I mean, you all know Einstein's definition of insanity, which is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And that's essentially what we've tried to do for the last 15 years. We've been a little insane, trying to get different results with pretty much the same efforts. The reasons this is important, I just wanted to put up these two charts for you. The reason this is so important is that, and you've probably all seen these charts, but I want you to look at them in a couple of ways you might not have looked at them in the past. You'll see that the United States is now 12th in the world in the share of its young adult population with a college education. There are two things that, and people will say, well, that's not so bad. Look at, we're not losing ground. We're doing okay. We're about the same as we've ever been. But there are a couple of things that are very important about this. I guess the good news of this is that we're 12th, but we're almost 4th, because there's not much difference between 4 and 12. So, you know, it could be worse. The bad news is if I'd shown you the countries that are on this side, there's also not much difference between 12th and 23rd. And the glide path, if you look, the only other country that looks at all like the United States is Israel. All of the other countries have substantial growth in the share of every decade of every cohort by decade in their country. So they have a progression and a trend that is very different than ours. We are basically a stable country. Everybody else is growing. Unless they're all going to just stop now, we've got a heck of a challenge in front of us, because we will continue to lose ground. And that is true of most of the countries that are near us but behind us at the present time. More important than that, though, just the numbers and how we compete, is if you think about how this will affect our economy. When those people who are in that 4th cohort, 55 to 64, those folks my age who are getting ready and looking at pulling out of the labor force, when we move out of the labor force, our country loses a very large share of its best educated cadre of folks, its most highly skilled cadre of folks. When Korea, on the other end, when those folks retire, not so much. They were not well educated. They're not going to lose a lot from their economy as those people move out. We not only have to try to keep up with these other countries, but we have a replacement issue that is much more substantial than any of the other countries. So for us, the challenge is a double challenge. And we're doing this, I would mention. We are much more ethnically diverse than any of those countries you see there. And we know that we have not served our communities of color very well in higher education. And if you look where the growth is going to be in this country, is going to be from those communities. So we have sort of a lot of things to work on very hard as a country. Now, the good news for Montana is, and Montana is right over Paul's shoulder, or left shoulder here. The good news is that Montana is not one of those states that's just sort of stagnant. You have a much better educated young adult population than you do an older adult population. And I think that bodes well for you in many respects. In fact, you are one of the very few Western states that actually fits in that category. But as a country, we are not in great shape. So that's what I sort of wanted to share with you. I think there's great hopes that I'm very optimistic that the federal government will move forward with reauthorization. I'm about one of 3 people that I know that thinks they'll actually do it this year. The good news is one of those is Senator Alexander, and he has the capacity to do that if he wants to. But if it doesn't move this year, it will probably move, I mean, it certainly will move relatively soon. And I think there's a general sense that the federal government needs to be somewhat more somewhat smarter and more in line in partnership with the states than they have been in the past. In fact, there are even people at the federal level now talking about a new federalism where there be an intentional partnership between the states and the federal government. that's what I came to say. Thank you very much for inviting me. I don't know where we are in terms of whether you want to have comments or what.
Some questions and comments. We've got up till noon, actually, so we got a bit for questions if board members have.
Questions from the board? Regent Sheehy.
How did you learn all this in conjunction with Witchy?
Well, I learned a lot of this when I worked at the federal level. I mean, I remain the longest sitting assistant secretary for post-secondary education in the history of the Department of Education. That's not saying that much. The department's only been around 25 years, and many of them didn't stand. So I was there almost all of the Clinton years, which were big years for higher education policy. I also, early in my career, I was the principal analyst for higher education for the Congressional Budget Office. So I did, and that was during basically that sort of first round of reform from the Higher Education Act. And I did my doctorate in higher education. So, I mean, this is my love, my passion. So that's how I did that. But Witchy spends a lot of time trying to think about how federal policy affects the West and trying to convince people in Washington, D.C. that there is a West. I mean, when many of the people there think about policy, they are really captured by the Beltway and by their own influential areas, and they tend to come from the Northeast to a great extent. So we spend a lot of time not lobbying, because we don't lobby, but we help provide information and counsel to people.
Well, this was very informative, and I wondered if you had, the top 3 things that you would tell a board such as ours to really keep in mind as we plan for our future economically.
Well, 2 or 3 things. I mean, and we say this, and it's not just federal policy. We talk a lot about the fact that you should think, an awful lot of what makes higher education go are the dollars we have to make higher education go. So finance is really important. We talk about how you ought to always think, when you're talking about one component of the financing structure, to think about all of the others in the interaction. So we talk about bringing your policies on appropriations, tuition, and financial aid. And when you're thinking of those, you should think about them together, and you should think about the state's engagement in those and the federal engagement in those at the same time, because we tend to compartmentalize those at both the federal and the state level. And we think of financial aid as sort of the demand side of the equation. Does this make it possible for the students to go to college and to stay in college? And we think about appropriations and tuition. Well, we think about appropriations and tuition as the supply side. Are we giving the institutions enough money so they can provide the education to those students? But in fact, they're integrally related. If one of those is out of sync, then the other one can't work. And so they need to come together. And if your policies don't intentionally think about how they relate to the federal policies, then you really can be out of sync there. California's got the classic failure in this regard. They don't have, for all practical purposes, they have no tuition in their community colleges. The result is they have no marginal revenue. Marginal revenue is very important for universities and colleges. If you don't have tuition revenue, you don't have the capacity to deal with new students that show up that you didn't anticipate. You don't have a lot of things. So marginal tuition dollars are an extremely important part to both supply, and unless you have supply, you can't meet demand. So that when a new student shows up in a community college in California, they don't get anything, so they can't put on a new class. And as a result, they had 300,000 students who were enrolled but couldn't take classes. Go figure. Now, if they charged tuition, they could do that, and guess what? It wouldn't cost the students anything because they get a tuition tax credit or a larger bill. It was a failure to think about how these things work together. And I think you ought to, as you're sort of still in the developmental stages on your financial aid system. And we've helped a number of states look at ways in which, as you develop that out, you can do it in a smart way that that leads to increased benefits to your students and to you guys, and part of that can come at the expense, I suppose you could call it, of the feds.
Yeah.
But they've got their programs designed for that purpose. That's not bad.
Yeah, I would just add to that, that's exactly right. And Montana's financial aid system, policy, whatever you want to call it, has largely relied on Pell. And I know I said sort of in jest, how do we intersect? But we intersect largely through what that does for our students. Our need-based aid is really centered around Pell. We don't have much in Montana that goes beyond that. In fact, about $70 million a year of our budget comes from Pell. 17,000 students, which is about 40% of our students, are getting around $3,600. So for as much as we talk about tuition, we can't lose sight of the fact that Pell has a huge impact, and decisions made at the federal level on Pell could have a huge impact on students, probably even more so than some of the tuition and fee conversations that we had. Not that they're not important, but how these relationships interact and ultimately sort of where we go in the Reauthorization Act could have a dramatic effect on us. And we are one of those states that really, when it comes to need-based aid, don't have much of a fallback plan other than Pell. That's our plan. And it's worked, but it leaves us fairly vulnerable to a change in federal decisions.
I have a question about, you mentioned the federal completion agenda. Unless I'm missing it, I don't see much of a federal completion agenda. I see a potential future federal completion agenda. It appears to me that the completion agenda, perhaps nationally, is really being driven by innovation at the state level. I mean, if you talk about the folks around this board, we all know what our completion agenda really is, or parts of it. Do I get that right? I mean, are the states kind of pushing this?
You get it partly right. I will tell you what I think the federal completion agenda is. And part of it's been rhetorical. The president has used the bully pulpit. Many of the states and many of the goals the states have set have been driven by the president's goal, which was that we would lead the world again in completion rates, that we would get to, I think his goal, I confuse his with the one from the Lumina Foundation, but I think his was that we'd get to 60% of young adults by 2020. And so he established the goal. Now, did he do anything to help us get toward that goal? The thing that they have done, that I think was intentional and was focused on completion, is a lot of, and it's not so much out of the Department of Education as it is out of the Department of Labor. Those TAC grants were really designed to improve two things: to improve the education in community colleges and to enhance the number of strong high-value certificate programs as well as associate degree programs that people could take and return. One of the things that's going to be important to the question earlier, I guess it was Martha's question, that I think is really important for you folks to think about too, is you can't get to where you need to go as a state on recent high school graduates alone. You're going to have a number of adult students returning that will be an important part of getting to those higher levels. And not only that, their lives, they won't be able to have as productive lives unless you find ways in which you can provide avenues for them. And for many of those adults, they're coming back to college, and we're providing them college education for reasons a bit different than we do for the traditional aged youth. I mean, for that traditional college student, we're trying to educate them. We're also trying to civilize them. We're trying to, we're doing a lot of, that's really a movement into adulthood. For that adult student who comes back, they want a job, and they want an improved life coming from that. And high-value certificates can be a really great way of getting to them, and that's a lot of what the TAC grants are designed to try to get at. So I think that there was that effort as an effort to get to greater college levels of completion. But I think you are correct. Now, what I do hear them moving toward is I think you will see it as a major part of the next round of federal activity. But I think your point in general is true. The more aggressive activity, it's actually one of the things I often say. I'll give a presentation like this, and then I'll say, the federal engagement is important, but don't get enamored of the federal government. You guys really make the difference. It's really state policy and practice that make it possible. That's where 3/4 of American higher education students are engaged, and whether your policies promote or impede their success is much more important in many respects than the federal government's. So take advantage of the federal government, think intentionally about it, help the federal government move in the right ways, but you're not going to be able to blame them if we don't get there.
Thank you. Regent Robinson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a question kind of on the tail end of what the commissioner was talking about with the Pell grants, and also the history that you gave here, which was really fascinating to see how things have evolved, and as you mentioned, the scope creep that has happened over a number of decades. I guess I have two questions. One is more of a question towards ourselves, but the first question is to you, regarding how the public education, higher education started in the intent, and that there was really a focus in trying to provide for those that really needed that financial assistance in order to give them a chance for a higher education, in order to ultimately impact their lives in a positive way. You know, I certainly have seen that in my own family in the 60s of benefiting, not understanding that, but with the older siblings, how they were able to go off to college and actually continue on and have quite an amazing career. Do you see, with the way that it's changed that focus or maybe diluted that focus a bit, is there, are we past that point? Is there going to be any effort to try to make sure that we are providing these avenues for those that need it the most? Because I think one of the most important things I heard you say this morning was, you know, those that need that, their choice is really based on price. If they look at the sticker price, can't do it, they're off to something else. Well, I'll stay at home and help Dad, and I'll maybe have, some work here locally. I'll sign up for the military. There's many other options that don't lead to that higher education. But I'm just curious, on a federal level, do you see a return to that at all, or do you see us moving away from providing for that need?
I'm optimistic that there'll be a renewed interest in assuring that all students, I think what you'll find is it'll be more than just getting them access, that there will be strong incentives for those students to stay committed. So for example, I'll give you an example I like a lot that I think you could see something appearing in the federal level potentially. In Massachusetts, they had the Pell Grant program, they had a pretty good state grant program, and they had low completion rates. And that's one of the dilemmas we're facing right now, is a lot of people say, well, your programs didn't work because look, so many of these students don't graduate. And it's to some extent a legitimate criticism. We'd hope that more of them would graduate. So what they did in Massachusetts, they call it a kicker. It's a Pell Grant kicker. And if you're a Pell Grant recipient and you complete 15 credit hours, you get an extra $2,000 in addition to everything else you were getting. You get that toward your next semester. And you actually get something if you complete 12, and something if you complete 9, and nothing if you complete less than 9. But it's geometric as well, so that you get a lot more for 15. So there's a real strong incentive. And interestingly, if in fact you don't get the whole amount for 2 semesters, but you go in the summer and you complete so that over the year you got 30 credit hours, then you get the difference that you lost. So what they've done is they try to say it's important for you not just their biggest problem, and the reason they did this is they found a lot of the students were enrolling 15 credit hours, but they weren't completing. We're benevolent to a fault in this regard, I believe, in higher education. We say, you're not doing great, maybe you ought to drop the course, whatever. And so they provide an incentive. It's not the end of the world if you don't get that, but it's really positive if you do get it. You get your award. And I think what you'll see is that I would almost bet money on it, that the federal government will go to a point where it won't be geometric. It'll be, I think, a straight line, but you won't get the full Pell unless you are enrolled and potentially complete 15 credit hours. And then it would move down from that. States can do a lot in this regard too, because you provide some incentives oftentimes for students to take fewer credit hours, lower cost. Some states have gone that you pay full credit, you pay full time for 12 credit hours. You don't pay if you take any more for that. So there's an incentive to take the 15 or maybe the 18 if you can handle it, because you get that for nothing. And so I think you're going to see efforts at the federal level to make sure that the students are committed. In Oregon's financial aid program that they developed called Shared Responsibility, they have a fairly substantial share expected from the students. And generally they'll say it's predicated on what a student can earn or reasonably borrow. But they also say, look, if you get a scholarship, you get to count that against this. If you saved in high school, you can count that against this. So they're providing an incentive for students to do some other things there as well. And I think actually one of the things we're talking to a lot of states about is doing more in what we used to call co-op work study, we're now calling earn and learn, which are combined programs where the student's program, academic program, is worked with employers. So that, Northeastern University, this is sort of their business plan, where the students take a 5 or 6 year baccalaureate, but they're working half-time for firms in their junior and senior year, and they're working for half-time in school, and the faculty, their employers, the people they're working for, their supervisors, are adjunct faculty with an instructional component to their work. The beauty of that is they earn their way. That's a great financial aid program. Plus, they've got tenure in a firm. They're more likely to stay in the state and leave. It's a wonderful program for engineering programs, for example, because it's one that you can structure in that way. They're hard to put together. The president's probably sitting here thinking, damn, what's Longenecker talking about those things? Because they're really hard to put together. But they are wonderful for students, and they're good for firms.
Regent Krause.
Thanks. Just a couple of things. Appreciated your history lesson. It was great. And I'm a graduate of Montana's institution dedicated to educating the sons and daughters of the calloused hands of toil, right?
Yes, right. Me too.
But it was, I think, Thomas Jefferson, a Southerner, that introduced a bill for the more general diffusion of knowledge. And someday we might have to talk about North versus South and Virginia and North Carolina and their egalitarian approach to higher education.
He was the first to well, not necessarily. Benjamin Franklin argues that he was the first to talk about this, but clearly there were people talking about it at that period of time, and he established the University of Virginia later in his career, but it wasn't federal government. It was after he'd left the federal service that he got into that.
Put it on his tombstone. So a couple of things really intrigued me. One of which is, and I'm not sure it's a question, but one of which is we talked so much about sort of the practical application of what it is we're trying to do here. We're the sons and daughters of the calloused hands of toil, right? The lifting up. And I think most of us would admit that have been dealing with this issue, we would plead guilty to this. We don't have much need-based aid in Montana coming from the state, and that's an issue. And we've talked about it, and it's a huge issue. But you talked about marketing. I think that's a big piece, marketing and telling people about it. And then the second thing is we talk about tuition or the cost of going to school, but not so much about how we could help students particularly in the more needy students, how we defer or how we soak up their cost of living, the cost of living being such a huge component.
Yeah.
And what do you see around the country, any kind of programs that say, if you come here, here's what we have to offer?
Yeah. Well, around the country, if you want to look at a really good design, philosophy, look at Oregon's design for shared responsibility, because it talks about a 5-way partnership. What the students should contribute as the principal beneficiaries of the education, what their parents should provide before you expect the public to come in, what the federal government does provide, what the states need to provide on top of that, and what the institutions need to do as partners in that. And talks about that in an intentional way of trying to put, and looks at the total cost of education, not just tuition. Just to use California as an example, if you are a bright student, it's cheaper to go to the University of California than it is to go to a community college in California. And nobody in California knows that. But it is, because what happens, because when you go to the University of California, you get a Pell Grant, a poor student going, a good student, you get a Pell Grant, you get a Cal Grant, which is very healthy, that's their state grant program. And the combination of those leaves you with less in living expense. It covers more than your tuition and covers a good portion of your living costs because you are a very needy student. You go to the community colleges in California, you don't have to pay tuition, but you get the Pell Grant and that's it. They don't provide grants to students for living expenses in the community colleges. And you know, that's the state that believes it's the most benevolent of all of the states because of its tuition policy. What it really is in the modern era, just looking at tuition as the tool to affordability is not sufficient. You have to look at the total package and the financial aid and how it fits in. And then if you're going to do that, you have to take into account the feds. If you want to look at something, I really like the Oregon plan. Idaho has adopted it. You can take a look at how Idaho's done it. Idaho did it as a pilot. And so they're doing it as a pilot and doing some research to look at the impact it has. Both of those were built on a fairly long-standing Minnesota plan. And those are the states that have the best approach to thinking about the total cost the students face in going to college. When you're a very poor person and you're looking at college, tuition is just one of your problems. And the other thing, one of the advantages of putting work into the equation is that for some communities, particularly some communities of color, if you don't work, if you're considered a wuss. And so telling students to go to college and not work makes them look like a wuss. So if you expect them to work, they can, and you give them a possibility, you can help them earn and learn.
Cool. Thank you.
Commissioner Christian.
Chair Tessa, just curious, David, what your thoughts are. And you mentioned state participation, state partnership, or kind of the skin in the game notion. How do you see that unfolding? I mean, you think it's as simple as sort of maintenance of effort language, or do you think it could be more robust than that from a federal level?
I think there's a really good chance it'll be much more robust than that. I think they've realized that maintenance of effort is cool, maybe good, but it doesn't provide you any incentive to move forward. It only prevents you from moving backwards. And I think they're much more interested in finding something that provides some incentive for states to move forward with them. So, I mean, I've been in discussions with fairly significant people who are looking at a $4 to $5 billion program that would match federal efforts smartly. I mean, they're not talking about looking at tuition. They're not talking about looking at need-based financial aid. They're talking about looking at net price as an affordability concept, and states that found a way, and they're smart enough to realize that states are in very different places, so that it has to look at sort of improvement rather as well as absolutes. Otherwise, states that have done it in the past get all the money, and somebody trying really hard is left out. So I think there's some really smart thinking going on, and I'm optimistic that that will help to drive some behavior. Now, if there's $4 or $5 billion, it probably comes from somewhere else.
President Engstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. David, thanks for coming out. Really
Good to be here,
great
Weiss.
presentation. So on this cost of education, if you ask, how much college costs, the answer is almost universally too much.
Yeah.
And so, in Montana, we've worked as hard as just about any state in keeping tuition affordable, and that $6,000 to $7,000 range and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Whether you're thinking of tuition or total cost of education, I'd like to just probe your thoughts on what should it be? I mean, is $6,000 the right number? Is $10,000 the right number? How do we even answer that question? What is the right investment level, I guess, for higher education? And then in your sort of ideal world, how do you split that up, federal, state, student?
Listen, I was having a pretty nice time, Royce, up to this one. Pontificating on other people, and now you brought it home. I don't know exactly what the right price is, but I know a couple things. I know that the $10,000 degree is silly. The idea that somehow you can achieve what needs to be done, especially it's silly for students who come from educationally at-risk backgrounds. They need the human touch, and you can't buy the human touch and provide a college degree for $10,000. We've got 2 states now that are they claim they've got $10,000 degrees. Both of those are, that's farcical. It's Florida and Texas. And in both cases, they're counting expenditures that others have made. So they're using prior learning assessment as well. I think that's wonderful, and I'd encourage the use of prior learning assessment, but that learning was achieved somewhere else at some expense, either personal or whatever. So it's not $10,000. So it's enough to make it work well. I think one of the things as an industry we will have to do, it's not more tomorrow than it is today, I don't think. If you're doing a good job today, we ought to be able to do a job tomorrow without more in real terms. And I was guilty of this. The doctoral program I was in, one of my professors was a guy named Bill Massey, and he wrote the book on why we should be hyperinflationary. Bill's still a friend of mine, still active in the field, and he says, I'm sorry, I was wrong. But everybody, we all believed it. We even had the story about the quartet and how you couldn't have a quartet with 3. And whatever. And I can go into all the reasons why we can make that case, but we can't afford that hyperinflationary model. So like other industries, some people don't like that term, but that's what we are. Like other industries, we have to find a way in which we can improve our productivity sufficiently to live within an inflation-adjusted, stable state of resources, I think. I think we have to recognize that the most difficult students to educate require more resources. And we provide the least resources to those institutions that serve the most difficult to serve students. And we've got to somehow come to grips with that, or we're not going to get the success and completion rates that we want to. In Ireland, in England, they pay more. They have a premium they pay for students who come from disadvantaged backgrounds. Now, interestingly, they don't provide it for enrollments. They provide it for success with those students. And many of the new performance funding schemes provide additional money for the graduation. So you'll get a certain amount for any graduation, for completion. You'll get a premium for if that student comes from an underrepresented group. You'll get a premium maybe if that's a student who's a Pell Grant student. You'll maybe get a premium if they were a Dev Ed student and they complete. In New Mexico, you could actually get 4 premiums in their old formula. And I don't know if it's going to survive the new leadership. So I think there are a couple of things. I think we have to find a way in which we live with what we've got today. And if you happen to be behind the curve in terms of funding on that, that's too bad. It's not going to change much. It may mean you're more efficient than the others. If you're ahead, that's good news. And if by chance the Bakken Reserve just provides more money than you could ever imagine, that'd be cool too. and you could find a way to usefully use more resources. But I think we have to find a way in which we can live within roughly the means we've got today to use innovation and new ideas, the use of technology in productive ways, is to help us do this within the range of funding we have today, and then find a way, if we've got more money, to invest it in those areas where it's most radically needed. I mean, students who come to us needing developmental education deserve the opportunity to get a college education as well. And today, if you look at the statistics, we aren't serving them adequately. Nationally, I don't know what the statistics are in Montana, but we need to find a way in which, when we've got a tough-to-serve student, we have the resources to serve that student adequately. I guess that's what I'd say, Royce. It's probably not what I should say to the president of the university, because you have fewer of those students than some of the others. But
Regent Johnstone.
Well, two observations, I suppose. One way of measuring the value of an education is to discount the future enhanced earning values, and at least all the recent analysis that I've seen proves that a college education is a bargain. I mean, if it's true that you're going to earn $1 million more or whatever it is, the college education, if you discount that back, particularly at current discount rates, it's a pretty good value. So I guess that's one way of measuring it.
Absolutely.
But the other observation I guess I'd make is that I actually think it may be a little bit disingenuous to suggest that the state hasn't stepped up to the plate somewhat to provide additional funding for education. But I think what we've chosen to do with it, or the state's chosen to do, is to do it across the board. So, you know, we've frozen tuition for everyone. We haven't made adjustments on some need basis for those who perhaps need lower education or lower tuition costs. We've done it across the board. Now, I think that's politically easier to do, but it may not be the right way to address the question of people that have greater needs.
Yeah.
Thank you. Further questions? Further comments? Seeing none. Thank you. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. I really enjoy coming up. How can you not want to be in Montana? This is just wonderful. Thanks so much.
Thanks for being here. We're now slightly ahead of schedule. Nice job. We will now break for lunch. Are they ready for us? Lunch is ready for us. So we will break for lunch. Back at 1:30.